Welcome to the second presentation in the series celebrating the 150th anniversary of Parsons. Tonight, Dave Maddox and I will be talking about the history of parks in Parsons. But before we get to the specifics about the parks, Dave wants to give you a little bit of background about life in the United States during the time that we will be discussing parks tonight.
We're talking basically in Parsons, the beginning of the parks was in the 1880s. In the United States, James Garfield was the president for a very short time. By 1881, he had been shot, not assassinated, but he did die 2 months later. Chester Arthur, the vice president, did become the president. Sitting Bull was leading the final group of his tribe, and he surrendered to United States troops in 1881 as well. The gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona was in 1881. Polygamy has been outlawed by the United States Congress by 1882. And 1883, the first vaudeville theater was opened in Boston, Massachusetts. So that's just a little bit of background as far as what was going on in the United States. And then in Parsons in the early 1880s, Parsons by 1881 was 10 years old after being founded in 1871. We were starting to get running water and gas. They were laying water lines and gas lines by 1881. Both the companies were still privately owned. They were not city-owned. There was no electricity and still no sewer system. But many of the frame buildings were being replaced by brick buildings. We had a new opera house in town. We had several new hotels and a new Masonic building by the early 1880s. Many of the original streets names were being changed. By the early 1880s, Riggs had become Central Avenue, Skiddy had become Washington, and all the number streets came into play in the early 1880s when they changed. Those were all named after people. By the early 1880s, we had changed that to numbers. Oakwood Cemetery has been in existence for 10 years by 1882. The first water tower in Parsons was built in 1883. As I said, there was no sewer, sanitation, or anything like that. However, by the early 1880s, Parsons did have a scavenger, a city scavenger, and he had a garbage cart that he rolled around and picked up dead animals. So I guess that was the beginning of sanitation in Parsons. Many of the streets are being, I have a hard time saying the word, macadamized. Basically, it's a rudimentary paving where they had crushed stone in some type of binder, but it was better than dirt, so we were starting to do that. And we did have several of the local newspapers were calling upon the city to do something about the city's lack of parks. So if you want to go to the first slide there.
The first call for parks in Parsons came from J.B. Lamb in May of 1881. He was the editor of the Daily Eclipse, and he suggested that we needed parks, that Parsons specifically needed parks for 3 reasons. Number one, he said that no great city could be without parks. He also said that if we waited much longer, the land for the parks would cost more than it would at the present time. And he also said that the city should have laid out parks when the city was first founded, and that would be a way to correct that mistake. Well, his call for parks pretty much went unnoticed and unheeded in the Daily Eclipse. So, as did many of the early newspapers, he wrote a little article that basically suggested something pretty much in jest or in tongue-in-cheek, and I'm going to read that from the Daily Eclipse. Mr. Lamb suggested that the city procure sufficient ground for park purposes, and after having it fitted up and planted to trees, that there be a saloon opened right in the center of it, and there be no such other in or around the town. And he was kidding, thinking that if we put a saloon in the middle of the park, it would be a popular thing and everyone would be ready to establish parks in the town.
You might get a little bit more support out of it. Okay, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, the first park established in Parsons was Forest Park. By December of 1881, the directors, the Forest Park Association directors, received a charter for 18 acres of land. They elected officers for 1 year, and they sold stock, 50 shares of stock at $100 apiece. So that was the beginning of the first park. By July 4th of 1882, that was the first large celebration held in Forest Park. In 1885, the Parsons Gun Club had established their club at the park, and they actually did shooting and that type of stuff there at Forest Park. By 1890, there was a baseball field located in Forest Park. By 1892, tennis courts. By 1897, the park had been donated to the city. They had tried to do it several times, but they finally got it done in 1897. The city connected water, put lights up, and they extended Forest Avenue through the land of Mike Schmidt's for easier access to Forest Park. And basically the Schmidt's land is what's now LCC. By 1897, there was a bicycle track built on the south side. It was a quarter-mile track. It had banked turns. And we think it was approximately where all the tennis courts were. If it was a quarter mile, it had to be a good-sized track, and so somewhere about where the tennis courts are now is where that would have been located. In the 1890s, they had a huge bicycle craze. Basically, the invention of the safety bicycle, which was a bicycle with front wheel and back wheel basically the same size, as opposed to the high wheelers that were somewhat dangerous. And so once they came out with the safety bicycle, it kind of started a huge craze. Parsons cyclists had monthly meetings or weekly meetings at the racetrack. There was a park caretaker's cottage built in 1898 on the grounds of the Forest Park. And by 1901, in 1901, over 200 shade and ornamental trees were planted, and the 2 drives that encircle the park were laid out, and that happened in 1901. Let's see if you want to go to the next one.
Yeah, I also might mention that one of the early caretakers of Forest Park was Zazu Pitts' father, who was a veteran of the Civil War, and he's listed as a caretaker to the park in the early city directory. Okay, what you see here is the pavilion that was in Forest Park. It was brought to Forest Park from El Dorado Springs, Missouri in 1901 by the Ladies Improvement Association. It was disassembled, rebuilt in Forest Park, and it was enlarged. A basement was added, the stage was improved, and the seating capacity was increased once it was recreated in our park. There are no color photographs, but descriptions indicate that it was painted dark green and white.
You want to go to the next slide there.
Okay. As you can see, it holds a lot of people. Contemporary accounts say that there was seating for 600 people and that the dance floor accommodated 60 couples. The pavilion has been, the location of the pavilion has been much discussed over the years, but it's our best guess at this point that it was located on the north side of the drainage area on the west side of the park, approximately where the Seton Pavilion is or where the new restroom facilities are located.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah. You can see there was a direct path to the pavilion, and it was always a place where people wanted to have their picture taken, that and the fountain in the park.
Next slide.
There's a colorized.
Right. There wasn't any color photos, but somebody colorized one. You can't really see the dark green there, but we'll take their word for it. The newspaper described it as dark green, so we'll go with that.
Right. And another iconic place to visit in the park during this time period was the fountain that's in Forest Park. It was established or built in 1901 as well. It cost $500, and it was just a short distance from the northwest entrance to Forest Park.
Go to the next slide.
There's a close-up view of it. It was paid for by private donation, and the ring at the bottom of the fountain is now located in the southeast corner.
Yeah, go to the next slide, and then one more slide will get you to the ring.
Yeah, the ring is now encircles a flower bed on the southeast corner of Forest Park. When I moved to Parsons in 1975, the ring was in its original location near the entrance to the park, directly east of Lebec Community College.
Next slide.
This slide shows us, if you look very closely, the two original urns that once flanked the Corning Street entrance to the park. Corning now stops at Forest Park, but at one time it ran through the park, and these ornamental urns were placed as part of the entrance to the park.
Go to the next slide.
Once again, the Ladies Improvement League was responsible for the erection of these urns. They cost $250. And the idea for these urns came from people visiting St. Louis during the 1904 World's Fair in their Forest Park. And apparently someone saw them there, liked their looks, and came back, and they raised money for these two urns.
Next slide.
And once again, here are people posing in front of and in, I guess, one of the urns. And we're very happy to report, as you probably know, that one of the restoration projects that will be happening during the 150th anniversary year is the restoration of one of the urns. The base will be rebuilt. The urn will be repaired and placed on a new base that replicates the older base where it once stood, and there will be a time capsule inserted in the base for future generations.
Next slide. There's what it looks like today, and we're trying to replicate that base as close as we can with the little rocks sticking out of the mortar. We think we have a plan as to how we can duplicate that, and so we'll put it back as close to the way as it was. It just won't be in the same location because they built the little kids' playground there on that. So, and then you can talk about those too. Mm-hmm. We don't have any pictures of those.
Yeah, okay. Since we're talking about the improvements in Forest Park, I might also mention that those improvements continued during the 20th century. In 1915, the stone gates at Corning were added. They were a memorial by Mrs. G.W. Hawk. In January 1937, there were memorial gates placed at the northwest corner of the park. And in 1930, the children's wading pool was donated to the city. They also built changing rooms and an area for a small kid's playground around the wading pool.
Go to the next. Yeah, there you go.
Well, here's a picture of something that's probably pretty familiar to people if they've lived in Parsons very long, and that is flooding in Forest Park. It's always been a problem. But the one thing that never really flooded in Forest Park was the Pavilion. There are accounts saying that the entire park is underwater except for the Pavilion, which was built on, if you look now at that particular spot, on one of the highest pieces of ground in the park.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah. And there's some examples of the water in the park.
And then the next slide.
Unfortunately, this water sometimes led to a tragedy. In 1905, an 18-year-old boy from Oklahoma City, Henry Hamilton, drowned in the floodwaters at Forest Park. And sometimes the ravine in the park with these floodwaters had water that was at least 10 foot deep. In 1956, flood control and the levee project on Lebec Creek was completed, and that helped with the flooding in Forest Park, as did later excavation of the ravine to help water leave the park a lot quicker. And some other improvements during that time. The first trees in 1883 were planted. In 1901, 200 different ornamental and shade trees were planted. And in 1904, a bunch of walnut trees were planted. And some of the walnut trees are still there. And there was a time when kids would go to the park and pick up walnuts, sometimes up to 100 bushels in one season. And in 1941, pecan trees were planted in the park, and some of those pecan trees are still there along Broadway, and we see people picking those up. So if you want to know how old those trees are, all the pecan trees date from 1941.
Okay. We'll talk a little bit about some later improvements to the park. In 1937, Forest Park and Glenwood Park swimming pools and the stadium in Marvel Park were started. And those were all PWA projects, Public Works Administration projects. They were paid for by a bond issue. The two pools and the stadium, the bond was $110,000 voted for by the people of Parsons. And the swimming pools did get built. And when they did open, the early family season tickets were available for $3. So you could take your family swimming for the whole summer for $3. Go to the next one. I can't remember what it is. Yeah. That's a little bit later picture of the swimming pool there. And so other improvements at the park then, besides the swimming pool, some things that people would probably remember. 1947, Arthur Glunt installed a miniature steam engine on a circular track there. And he took people for rides on the cars, and I always laugh at the price here because as a business person that makes no sense whatsoever, but he charged 9 cents to ride the train. I always thought, why would you ever charge 9 cents to ride the train? Why not make it a dime? It doesn't make any sense to go, you got pennies and all that, but whatever, that's what the newspaper said.
But it sounds so much cheaper.
I guess, maybe that's it. Maybe that was the deal. So that was in 1947, the little actual steam engine. By 1951, the Kiwanis train was running in Forest Park. And in 1956, the Kiwanis built a small ticket office, and they were smarter as far as I'm concerned. They charged 10 cents for the ride. In 1954, the Kiwanis installed that spiral slide that was there up until, I don't know, 2000 or something. I'm not even sure when they took it out, but I remember it being there. So, and the spiral slide, the Kiwanis paid $1,200 for that. In 1954, they installed the miniature car ride at a cost of $500. And then there were several improvements that were talked about but did not happen. One of them was people were clamoring in the early 1900s to have an artificial lake in Forest Park. That did not happen. And the other thing that did not happen was it was proposed sometime in the teens that put a golf course starting in Forest Park and going to Marble Park, and you would tee off in Forest Park and you drive over the creek into Marble Park, and you would play around and then drive back at some point in time, come back over. Obviously that did not happen. So
one of the things I love about this photograph are the abundance of trees, and it really gives you an idea that it does look like a forest.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, next slide. Okay, that kind of concludes the Forest Park portion. And then we'll move on to Marble Park. May of 1882, basically organized an association called the Parsons Fair and Driving Park Association. Made George Gabriel the president of that association, and he was a prominent doctor in town and was mayor for multiple terms, so he was a good one to have as president. They sold $20,000 in stock, 2,000 shares at $10 each. They purchased the land from G.C. Osgood, and they did have the first fair in Marble Park, or Parsons Fair and Driving Park at the time, October 10th through 13th in 1882. They had about 5,000 to 8,000 people attend, which is quite a few, I think. In 1884, the city limits were extended to include the driving park. And in 1887, I found a newspaper article talking about shooting matches that they had in Marble Park. And it wasn't shooting matches. You didn't shoot at clay pigeons, you shot at live pigeons. So they had live pigeons that they turned loose and shot away, and said it probably wouldn't be a too pretty a sight. But okay, so you can go to the next slide. In 1891, this picture is a picture of, basically it's the front and back of a postcard advertising the fair, October 13th through 16th. And this was, up until that time, the largest attendance ever. They estimated over 10,000 people came to this fair. And some of the attractions listed there are the Grand Tournament of Wheelmen, 1,000 wheels in a line. I'm assuming they had bicycles because this was the time of the bicycle craze. I'm assuming they had 500 bicycles lined up, and it said 1,000 wheels in a line, so they had some type of parade or something there. They had running, trotting, and pacing races with $2,000 in purses. Agriculture and horticultural displays, they had $5,000 in premiums. And they had something called the Humboldt Celebrated Young Ladies Military Band that provided the music. And they had excursion rates on the railroad, meaning you could come to the fair from other towns. The railroad, you just told them you were going to the fair, and they'd give you a cheaper rate. Okay, if you want to go to the next slide. So the first time that the park was actually called Marble Park was off this ad or this article in the newspaper, and it's The farm was actually purchased by, or the park was actually purchased by P.H. Haight. He was a wealthy businessman from Omaha, and it was in 1903. And he called it Marvel Park Farm. And so he made over $15,000 in improvements. And some of those were, he enclosed the park with a board fence. He put an elaborate arched gateway that said Marvel Park Farm on it. He built a new caretaker's cottage. He built new stables. He redid the racetrack. He regraded it and rolled it. And basically he wanted to house, breed, and train racehorses there. And so that's what he set out to do. He, besides that, he started what he called a zoological collection of wild animals. He had deer and antelope, and then he also had, at one point in time, wildcats. I don't think that went really good for him, because about every other week in the newspaper was an article about one of the animals escaping and doing something. So I don't think the zoo went real good for him. You could, as just a person in the city, if you wanted to use the track to drive your little buggy around and for entertainment, you could get a season ticket there for the use of the track for $3 for the year. They did hold races there yearly, and in conjunction with the fair. And in one of the fairs that they had with the races, they had and this was in 1904, they had a man that was doing balloon ascensions, and when they got up to a certain height, he would be fired out of a cannon. And things didn't go well for him either. One of his attendants who was supposed to be watching the balloon wasn't watching careful enough, and he didn't have enough air in it. So when he went to rise in the balloon so he could fire the cannon off and shoot himself out, he didn't get high enough off the ground. They basically fired him into the ground. Somehow he survived. They carted him off on a cot, and they said by the end of the night he was back. So apparently he was fairly tough. Let's see, you can go to the next slide. I think we may have missed one. Yeah, there's an advertisement there for the Marvel Park Farm, and talking about all the services that they offered, like we had talked about earlier. See if you want to go to the next one. There you go.
This is an example of the Marvel Park Fair and races. In 1908, it was in October 12th through 17th, which was a 5-day fair. It was one of the largest fairs since they had started. There were between 8 and 10,000 people attending. And as you can see, that there are rigs in front of the grandstand, and that the park was illuminated for vaudevillian performances. There was music, booths, and lots of different special attractions. They would contract with individuals to come to do a special event at the fair, sometimes just like they do at carnivals and fairs today. Most stores in town closed on Thursday afternoons to give people and employees an opportunity to go to the fair. And maybe next slide.
Yep.
Okay. The fairgrounds were sold to E.F. Jones. There were 60 acres that made up the park, and they sold for $18,000. The city at that time was interested in buying the land, but didn't want to spend $18,000. I believe their top offer was $15,000.
That's all they said. They weren't interested in purchasing at over $15,000. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Okay, this is going to be again a postcard that was mailed out to people advertising a race, and this was in 1909, that was held at Marvel Park, or a race that was supposed to be held at Marvel Park in 1909, featuring Minor Air and Dan Patch. And at the time, harness racing was one of the largest sports in the nation. And Dan Patch was the world record holder at 1:55 for the mile, and Minor Air was timed at 1:59. So this was advertised as a big deal that these two horses were going to race, possibly be a world record. Dan Patch at the time was undefeated. Most of the owners refused to even race him. He was one of the first athletes, and I'm calling him of any kind, whether it be human athletes or horse, to actually have endorsements. He earned millions of dollars in purses, and he earned a lot of money as an endorser as well. You can, if you're interested, you can type in Dan Patch on the internet and read all about him. He was super famous and probably one of the most famous. It would be like if we had a Kentucky Derby winner come to Parsons now, and this horse was that famous. And they traveled, both the horses, like I said, the owners were refusing to race him. So what happened was this guy that owned Dan Patch got together, and they decided to just make the circuit and see if they could attract crowds by racing these two horses. And they traveled in a specially equipped train car. It said it was plush upholstered stalls. It had rubber floors. It had swinging mangers so they could eat. It had sleeping accommodations for their attendants, and the attendants never left the horses alone. So unfortunately, the race didn't really pan out. Only about 3,000 spectators came. Most of those were from out of town. It wasn't enough really to pay what the owners of Dan Patch were wanting, and so there was they had big issues there. Finally, it ended up they agreed to take a portion of what they were owed, and they ran exhibition races separately, but everybody was not happy about that at all because it had been advertised as this big race, and it didn't happen. Unfortunately, the consequences of that were financial hardships for the park, ownership changes, and at one time, Marvel Park was actually platted to sell as lots for people to build on. So go to the next one, and then the next one.
Well, this is a fairly startling headline from the newspaper in Parsons, a corpse in Marvel Park. But if you really read the information carefully, it's kind of a funny story. Apparently, 3 different times bones were found in Marvel Park, and there was a big to-do about the bones, and thinking they were human remains. But the 3rd time this happened, there was an ad, and that's the bottom half of this. It says, "This is notification that I desire that all sleuths, detectives, and curiosity seekers desist from molesting the grave of my pet bulldog, Teddy, buried in Marvel Park on my own property." So poor Teddy was dug up 3 times while people were thinking they had found human remains. And finally, the owner said, "Let Teddy alone. He's in Forest Park. That's where he's going to stay."
Okay. By 1916, like I said, there had been financial problems with the park and everything, and basically the city had to decide. They had a possibility of either acquiring Marvel Park or a local doctor, Dr. Albert Smith, had volunteered to sell some property he had out by the Old Mercy Hospital as a park. And so the city had to decide on one or the other of them. They basically debated it, discussed it for a couple years, and then in February of 1918, decided to acquire the Marvel Park land. They condemned it and basically had an appraiser come in and appraise the land and then paid the property owners because some of the lots had been sold, like we had talked about earlier, that it had been platted at one time. Some of the lots had been sold, and so basically the city forced the property owners to sell, and they ended up in 1918 paying $16,700 for the property. Not that much less than what they could have bought it quite a few years before, but they did get it for $16,700.
They saved $2,000.
They saved a couple $1,000, right? So, next one. By 1920, they decided they needed a new grandstand. This is a picture of that grandstand that was built in 1920. This one would accommodate 2,000 people. North of the grandstand, they had bleachers that would seat another 2,500. The racetrack was improved, and it was now a horse racetrack, or it was improved enough that automobiles could drive on it. They had the first TriState Fair here in 1920, and the fair was held annually until 1942. During World War II, they decided not to have the fair for a few years. They did try and restart it in 1946 and through 48. Limited success. It just didn't go. So basically, they had about 20 years of the TriState Fair there. And then this is going to show you we talked about it was improved for horses or cars. Well, this is kind of a combination here. Bulldogging by auto. And this is in the 1921 fair and roundup there. One of the thrills of the afternoon, according to the Parsons Sun, was bulldogging of a steer from the running board of an automobile. Professor J.C. Olson had donated the use of one of his new Essex touring cars for the stunt. And according to the Sun, it was all over in a wink and one hardly had time to get excited. But it looks fairly dangerous to me.
Is that the Olson from Olson's Business College?
Yeah, he was. Professor Olson was the head of the Parsons Business College, but he also sold Essex touring cars. So if you want to go to the next one, there you go.
This is one of my favorite photographs in this series. It was taken at 10:30 at night, and there's a huge crowd if you look closely. Lots of children there as well. It's from the 1932 TriState Fair. Part of the Alamo show, which was a touring show that the exhibitors had paid for these people to come here, was Captain Ben Mouton and his fearless, fiery high dive. Basically, he dove 130 feet into a furnace of fire, and he did it twice daily.
That's my favorite part of the whole thing. You know, climb up 130 feet, dive into a tank twice daily.
And the show was free, but as Dave said, he climbed up a 130-foot tower. He soaked his coat in gasoline, then lit himself on fire, and then dived into the small tank of water to put himself out. I love that story.
Yeah. Yeah, what twice daily?
Yes.
Why not light
Why
yourself on fire twice a day and dive into a little tank from 130 feet? Sounds reasonable to me. I use this one.
Okay, what we have here are newspaper photographs, and they document the new stadium, the PWA project. In 1937, a new grandstand at Marvel Park was built by the PWA at a cost of $48,900 with a seating capacity of approximately 4,000. It was built on the site of the old grandstand, and they used about 900 cubic yards of concrete in the construction. Next slide, maybe. And this is also a WPA project. This is the Marvel Park wall, which is, as is the grandstand, still standing. The difference between, Dave, do you want to explain the difference between WPA and?
There were two different organizations, the WPA, Works Progress Administration, and then the PWA, the Public Works Administration. The WPA, basically they're the ones that came to a local community, and they hired local people, unskilled workers, and then they had supervisors that basically knew what they were doing that put these unskilled workers to work. And so you could build a wall or you could build something small with unskilled labor. You probably wouldn't want to build a swimming pool or a stadium or something like that. So the PWA was the Public Works Administration. That was one where basically it provided money to local communities to then bid out the projects and actually get someone, a regular contractor, to do it. So that's the difference. Just one's unskilled local people that were unemployed, and then the other one is, they provided money to actually bid it out like they would normally do.
And on this wall, 115 men were hired to construct this wall.
Okay, we're done with the Marvel Park, and now we're on to Glenwood Park. There was a clamoring for people who wanted a park on the west side, and it seems odd to say Glenwood Park is on the west side, but at that time, it was the west edge of the community. So in 1901, residents of the then west side organized the Glenwood Park Association. They bought 10 acres of land between the railroad tracks and 21st Street, and the original cost of that 10 acres of land was $375. By 1982, they had dug a well. There was seating in the park. They had a bridge over the creek. And then they actually did build a man-made lake there. They dammed the lower end of the creek that was closest to 21st Street. The lake was about a half mile long, 50 feet wide, and 3 to 6 feet deep. And they did buy, they had 5 pressed steel boats were purchased to be used by patrons of the park. If you want to go to the next one. And this is one of the very few pictures of Glenwood Park. I can't even look at this picture without laughing. One of the few pictures of Glenwood Park. There just isn't much. It's the only one. I don't know whether you've seen any others. I know of no other early pictures of Glenwood Park, and we always laugh. The guy hanging from the sign adds a lot to the photo. But anyway, by 1904, there was a Palace steam riding merry-go-round, and it ran by steam, and it was open from 2 to 5 on Thursdays and Fridays. And in July 1904, they actually had 1,500 people attend a concert by the Queen City Band at Glenwood Park, and they did not expect to have anywhere close to that many people, so a pretty good turnout for that. If you want to go to the next slide. By 1905, they had laid out baseball grounds at Glenwood Park. They built a grandstand in the northwest corner of Glenwood Park, and it had a capacity of 700 people. It had a roof on it. And the team that played in that stadium or on that ballpark was in the Missouri Valley League, and it was a professional team. And it was named the Parsons Preachers. And I couldn't figure out why you would name your team the Parsons Preachers, but when they got ready to start their first game as a Parsons team, they didn't have a name. It was around Easter time, and they decided, well, Preachers works good. We'll be the Parsons Preachers. So anyway, their first home game was in May of 1905, and I always liked, again, newspapers had quite the sense of humor back then, and I always liked the article that was in the Parsons Weekly Sun. Fully 1,500 people were present to witness the game, besides 150,000 people who saw the game from outside the fence, from the trees, and other places of vantage. So apparently a lot more people watched the game than the people that had paid. And the interesting thing about the Parsons Preachers are, as you can see, there's photographs, or those are actual baseball cards, of two guys there. One of them, the bottom one, is Dusty Rhodes. He was a pitcher. And the top one is Babe Adams, who was also a pitcher. Rhodes played with the Parsons Preachers for several years, as did Adams. Both of them went to the major leagues. As you can see the Rhodes' picture is taken in a St. Louis Cardinals uniforms. And then Babe Adams played for Pittsburgh. It was the precursor of the Pirates, and I can't remember what they called them then. It wasn't the Pittsburgh Pirates, but it was the Major League Pittsburgh team. And the interesting thing about Babe Adams is, in 1909, the Pittsburgh team was in the World Series, and he pitched, and he won. It's a 7-game series. He won 3 of the 7 games. And so, amazingly, that's amazing for a pitcher. It will never happen again, because they won't let pitchers pitch that. But he won 3 games in the World Series, in the 1909 World Series. Okay, next slide.
Here's a later picture of Glenwood Park that shows the lake that wound its way through the park, basically where the ravine is now that has all those big white rocks in it. That's basically where it was. In 1912, Glenwood Park also became home of the city's tourist camp. It became a popular spot for people traveling by automobile. And if you go down 21st Street right now, let's say you're driving down 21st towards Southern, you can see 2 stone pillars, and it says Parsons Tourist Camp, and then has the date. Those still exist. So people would travel by car, camp out of their car, maybe set up a pop-up tent, and use that as a camping spot on cross-country trips. According to the Parsons Sun, in 1922, Parsons Tourist Camp was named the best tourist camp in the state because it had electricity, it had sanitary bathrooms, and they had places where people could cook, and it was just a well-equipped park and received statewide recognition. In 1936, as David mentioned, the swimming pool was added to Glenwood Park, and it was built for black residents. It's now the Parsons Arboretum and the Sievert Visitor Center, I believe. Yes. So. Okay, we're switching a little bit. Even though it wasn't a city park, it was an athletic park, so we want to talk a little bit about the Katy Athletic Park. It was dedicated in September 1916. It had a half-a-mile track, and the grandstand was quite large. It seated 6,000 people. In October of 1916, Parsons hosted the Parsons Katy Athletic Meet, where over 12,000 people came to Parsons for festivities. Basically, this was kind of like a Katy Olympics, where people, employees from all aspects of Katy work from different towns, all across the region converged, and there was a week-long athletic competition in different areas. Special trains were brought in for families and for the athletes. The city decorated the town with banners. There was a big parade that led to the field, and there were carnivals of the evening. There were also tennis courts, a ball diamond. They took an old rail car and turned it into a shower area. They took an old dining car and turned it into an emergency hospital. And the Katy Railroad put up between $12,000 and $15,000 just to make this event happen. But it was a special event for several years.
By July of 1922, the Katy shop workers went on strike. This is a photo of the National Guardsmen that came. Martial law was declared July 8th, 1922 for Parsons and Lebec County. And you can see they're camped on the Katy Athletic Field. You can see the grandstand in the background there. And basically, this action was taken, the sending in of the National Guard was taken to guard the Katy property and supposedly to maintain order in the city. Let's skip to the next one. There were other events other than running and baseball at the Katy Athletic Field. Like Mike said, they did have tennis matches there. This is a picture of a boxing match, but they did have those two things. There were also, if you want to skip to the next one, I think, yeah, there were also football games, and this is a poster advertising a high school, Parsons High School versus Chanute High School at the Katy Athletic Field. So several things happened, different kinds of events happened there. And at one 1931 baseball game, another thing that at some point in time, I think I'm going to do a thing that says things that weren't a good idea that happened in Parsons. This would fall into that category as far as I'm concerned. An advertisement in the Parsons Sun for a baseball game, and it said, this is what the ad said: "Watch for Paul Hibbs and his doodlebug. He will fly over the diamond before the start of a game and drop 5 baseballs from 200 feet. Players catching them will receive $5 for each ball caught." Again, I'm not thinking that's a great idea and probably wouldn't happen today. Well, why don't you tell them a little bit about Paul Hibbs and the doodlebug?
Paul Hibbs was kind of known locally because of the doodlebug, which was a small airplane that he built in his garage in his spare time. And it made exhibition flights around town and different appearances. There's all kinds of photographs, I think, of the doodlebug. And the museum has a whole notebook with pictures of the doodlebug. It was quite famous. His
garage was on Washington, 16th and Washington, somewhere around 16th and Washington, and he just built an airplane in his garage. Of course, why not? So, okay. Want to go to the next slide? Okay. One of the more interesting things, as far as I'm concerned, is that happened at the Katy Athletic Field is in 1918, the city's Chamber of Commerce decided they wanted to have some big league baseball games here. And so somebody had some pull and managed to get this done. So like I said, in 1918, April 1st through 4th, they managed to get the St. Louis Cardinals to come and play the Kansas City Blues. Kansas City Blues used the Katy Athletic Field for their spring training, and so they just got the Cardinals to come. I'm not sure how you pull that off, but they did come and they played 4 games in Parsons. And if you look at the lineup, the Cardinals lineup there, you see Hornsby was at shortstop. Hall of Famer Rogers Hornsby played in Parsons. and he was referred to by the Parsons son as the Cardinals' $75,000 man because that was his yearly salary. The players came here by rail, stayed at the Matheson Hotel, and one of the more interesting things, so basically you would watch a big league game for 50 cents because that's what they charged for admission. So, okay.
And one of the things that we hope to do before the 150th anniversary is over is to install a commemorative plaque in Glenwood Park that talks about its important history as an athletic showcase for the community.
Okay, next slide. Okay, and then right after the Cardinals were there the 1st of April, the Chicago White Sox were there. And the interesting thing about that, and it was just a 2-game series, but the White Sox had won the World Series. They were world champions in 1917, and then in spring of 1918, they were in Parsons playing again the Kansas City Blues. And so you had a chance to, again, for 50 cents, see the world. Can you imagine now if we go, we're going to get the World Series champs to come to Parsons the next year after they've won the World Series, but that happened here. And again, if you look at the lineups, if you're familiar with White Sox history, playing left field for the White Sox, shoeless Joe Jackson. Unfortunately for the White Sox, a year after playing in Parsons, again, if you're familiar with baseball history at all, 7 of the 8 White Sox players who played in Parsons in 1918 were banned from Major League Baseball after the 1919 World Series. They won the World Series in 1917, came to Parsons in 1918, did not make it to the World Series in 18, but in 1919 they went back to the World Series and they lost, but they were accused of throwing the World Series, and 7 of the 8 players that are on that lineup that you see right there were banned from baseball for life because of that, because of the Black Sox scandal, including Joe Jackson. So a few more later developments at the Katy Athletic Field. Basically, by the 1930s, the Great Depression's going on. It fell into disrepair. Also, the state hospital had built a ballpark that had lights, and that was another thing that obviously the Katy field did not have lights. So basically the state hospital kind of took over and had most of the bigger games there. Unfortunately, by the late 1930s, the only thing the field was being used for was a practice field for the high school and the junior college up until 1942. July 1942, they tore the grandstand down. And so one thing I would mention about, doesn't have anything to do with Katy Athletic Park, but does have to do with the State Hospital field. I believe in 1949, Mickey Mantle played at the State Hospital field, and we've got box scores that show Mantle playing. He was playing for Baxter Springs at the time for a Van Johnson league. But anyway, that kind of concludes the parks section, I believe.
Yeah, and thank you for watching.
Thanks.